Good morning and a very warm welcome to this week's podcast. Today we are focusing on Psalm 69 in our continuing series on the Book of Psalms. May our thoughts, our words and our deeds be forever acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our sheltering rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The words of Psalm 69. I decided, I will watch what I say, and make sure I do not sin with my tongue. I will put a muzzle over my mouth, whilst in the presence of an evil man. I was stone silent. I held back the urge to speak. My frustration grew, my anxiety intensified. As I thought about it, I became impatient. Finally, I spoke these words. O Lord, help me understand my mortality and the brevity of life. Let me realize how quickly my life will pass. Look, you make my days short-lived, and my lifespan is nothing from your perspective. Surely all people, even those who seem secure, are nothing but vapor. Surely people go through life as mere ghosts. Surely they accumulate worthless wealth without knowing who will eventually haul it away. But now, O Lord, upon what am I relying? You are my only hope. Deliver me from all my sins of rebellion. Do not make me the object of fools' insults. I am silent and cannot open my mouth because of what you have done. Please stop wounding me. You have almost beaten me to death. You severely discipline people for their sins. Like a moth, you slowly devour their strength. Surely all people are just a mere vapor. Hear my prayer, O Lord. Listen to my cry for help. Do not ignore my sobbing, for I am a foreign resident with you, a temporary settler, just as all my ancestors were. Turn your angry gaze away from me, that I can be happy before I pass away. This is the word of the Lord. Protracted suffering, recognized as chastisement for sin, has wasted the psalmist's strength. It has been borne for a while in silence, but the rush of emotion has finally burst the floodgates. The psalm does not repeat the words which forced themselves from the hot heart, but preserves for us the calmer flow which followed. It follows into 4 parts, the first 3 of which contain 3 verses each, and the 4th is divided into 4. The first part, verses 1 to 3, is the frustrated resolve of silence. Its motive was fear of sinning in speech, while the wicked are before me. That phrase is often explained as meaning that the sight of the prosperity of the godless, in contrast with his own sorrows, tempted the singer to break out into arraigning God's providence, and that he had schooled himself to look at their insolent ease without murmur. Yet the psalm has no other references to other men's flourishing condition. It is perhaps more in accordance with its tone to suppose that his own pains, and not their pleasures, prompted the withheld words. The presence of the wicked imposed upon his devout heart silence as a moral obligation. We do not complain of a friend's conduct in the hearing of his enemies. God's servants have to watch their speech about him, when the godless are listening, lest a hasty word give occasion for malicious glee or even blasphemy. And so, for God's honour, the psalmist put restraint upon himself. The word rendered bridle in verse 2 is better translated as muzzle, for a muzzle closes the mouth, but a bridle does not. The resolution, energetically expressed, was vigorously carried out. I made myself dumb in still submission. I kept silent. And what was the result? My sorrow was stirred. A grief suppressed is increased, as everyone knows. And the closing words of verse 2 are obscure and can be variously understood. Some consider them an elliptical form of from good to bad, and expressing completeness of silence. Others take the good to mean the law, or the praise of God, or even good fortune, or such words as would serve to protect the singer from slander. But the prepositions employed here, when following a verb meaning silence, do not induce that concerning which silence is kept, but a negative result of that silence. The meaning perhaps then is best given by some such paraphrase as without joy or I had no comfort. The hidden sorrow gnawed beneath the cloak like a fire in a hollow tree. It burnt away fiercely, unseen, eating its way at last into sight. Locked lips make our hearts hotter. Repression of speech only feeds our fire of emotion, and sooner or later the muzzle breaks, torn off, and a pent-up feeling breaks out into speech. Often the wilder for the violence done to nature by the attempt to deny its way. The psalmist's motive was right, and in a measure his silence was so. But his resolve did not at first go deep enough. It is the heart and not the mouth that has to be silenced. To build a dam across a torrent without first diminishing the sources that supply the water will only increase the weight and pressure and ensures a muddy flood when it bursts. Does the psalm proceed to recount what its author said when he broke silence? At first sight this may appear so, but on the other hand, the calm prayer which follows, beginning with verse 4, is not of the character of the wild and whirling words which were suppressed for fear of sin, nor does the fierce fire of what the psalm has been speaking flame. It seems, therefore, perhaps more probable that those first utterances, in which the overcharged heart relieved itself, and which were tinged with complaint and impatience, are not preserved, and did not deserve to be, and that the pathetic, meditative petitions of the rest of the psalm followed, as after the first rush of the restrained torrent becomes a stiller and calmer flow. Such a prayer might well have been offered while the wicked were still before me, and might have been laid to heart by them. Its thoughts are like a cool hand laid on the singer's hot heart. They damp the fire burning within. There is no surer remedy for inordinate sensibility to outward sorrow than a fixed conviction of the shortness and illusion of life. And these are the two thoughts which the prayer casts into sweet but sad music. It deals with the commonplaces of thought, which poets and moralists have been singing and preaching since the beginning of time, in different tones and with discording application, sometimes with fierce revolt against the inevitable, sometimes with a paralyzing consciousness of it, sometimes using these truths as argument for baser pleasures and aims, sometimes toying with them as occasion for cheap sentiment and artificial pathos, sometimes urging them as motives for strenuous labour. But of all the voices which have ever sung or prophesied of life's short span and shadowy activity, none can be nobler, saner, healthier, or calmer than of our psalmist today. The stately words in which he proclaimed the transiency of all earthly things are not transient. They are nothing but a breath, but they have outlasted much that seemed solid, and their music will sound as long as man is on his march through time. Our days have a measure. They are a limited period, and the measurer is God. But this fleeting creature, man, has an obstinate fancy of his permanence, which is not all bad indeed, since without it there will be little continuity of purpose or concentration of effort, but may easily be led to extremes and hide the fact that there is always an end. Therefore the prayer for divine illumination is needed, that we may not be ignorant of that which we know well enough, if only we would think of it ourselves. The solemn convictions of verse 5 are won by the petitions of verse 4. He who asks God to make him know his end will have already gone a long way toward knowing it. If he seeks to estimate the measure of his days, he will soon come to the clear conviction that it is only the narrow space that may be covered by one or two breaths of a hand. So do the noisy years shrink when heaven's time is applied to them. A lifetime may look long, but set against the eternity of God's years, it shrivels but to a minute and imperceptible point, having position but never magnitude. This thought of brevity naturally draws after it that of illusion. Just because life is so frail, does it assume the appearance of futility? Both ideas are blended in the metaphors of a breath and a shadow. There is a solemn earnestness in the threefold surely, confirming each clause of the seer's insight into the hollowness of earth. How emphatically he puts it in the almost pleonastic language. Surely nothing but a breath is every man, stand he ever so firm. The truth proclaimed is undeniably certain. It covers the whole ground of our earthly life, and it includes the most prosperous and the most firmly established. A breath is the very emblem of transiency and unsubstantiality. Every solid body can be melted and made into gaseous vapour, were enough heat to be applied. Those who habitually bring human life before thee dissolve into vapour the life-seeming illusions which cheat others and save their own lives from being but a breath by being seen to be what they are. The pause at the end of verse 4 does not seem to mark a logical pause in either thoughts, nor does it coincide with the end of the part of the psalm, but emphasizes perhaps long drawn sad notes of the teaching of the words. This thought continues unbroken, and verse 6 is closely connected to 5 by the repetition of surely and breadth, as well as in subject. The figure changes from breath to shadow, literally from the Hebrew meaning image, not a sculptured likeness, but an insubstantial apparition. The glories of our birth and state are shadows and not substantial things, and all the movements of men coming and going in the world are but the dance of a shadow. As they are a breath, so are their aims. All their hubbub, turmoil and activity is but like the bustle of ants on their hill. Immense energy and toil, but nothing comes of it at all. If any doubt remained as to the correctness of this judgment, of the aimlessness of man's toil, one fact would confirm the psalmist's sentence: that the most successful man in our midst labours to amass and has to leave his pile for another, whom he may not even know, to gather into his storehouses and to scatter by his prodigality. There may be an allusion in the words to harvesting. The sheaves are piled up, but in whose barn are they to be housed? Surely, if the grower and the reaper is not the ultimate owner, his toil has been but for a breath. All this, though, is no fantastic pessimism. Still less is it an account of what life must be. If any man's is nothing but toiling for a breath, and if he remembers himself is nothing but a breath, it is his own fault. Those who are joined to God have in their embers something that lives, and if they labour for him, they do not labour for vanity, neither do they leave their possessions when they die. The psalmist makes no reference to a future life, but the following section shows that though he knew his days were few, he knew too that if his hope were truly set on God, he was free from the curse of illusion and grasped no shadow, but the living substance, who would make his life blessedly real and pour into it substantial good. The effect of such convictions of life's brevity and emptiness should be to throw the heart back upon God. And in the third part of the psalm, verses 7 to 9, this higher strain can be heard. The singer turns from his dreary thoughts, which might so easily have become bitter ones, to lay hold on God. What should earth's vanity teach but the sufficiency of God? It does not need the light of a future life to be flashed upon this mean, swiftly vanishing presence in order to see it seen in a more celestial light. Without that transformation, it is still possible to make it great and real by bringing it into conscious connection with God. If hope and effort are truly set on him, amidst the smallness and perishable nature of the outer world, our hopes, will not be chasing shadows or working for vanity. The psalmist sought to calm his heart by the contemplation of this end. But this is a poor remedy for worry and grief, unless it leads to actual contact with the one enduring substance. It did so with him, and so we hear that grief grew calm, just because hope was not dead. To preach the vanity of all earthly things to heavy hearts is nothing but pouring vinegar on a problem, unless it is accompanied by the great antidote to sadness and the depreciating view of life. The thought that in it men may reach their hands upon the time that enmeshes them and grasp hold of the hand of the unchanging God. This psalm is no reference to life beyond the grave, but it finds in present communion, by waiting and hoping, emancipation from the curse of fleeting triviality, which haunts every life that is separated from him, like that which the Christian hope of immortality gives. God is the significant figure who gives value to the row of ciphers of which every life is made up. Blessed are those who are driven by earth's vanity and drawn by God's fullness of love and power to fling themselves unreservedly into his arms and nestle themselves there. The strong recoil of the devout soul from a world in which it has been profoundly felt to be shadowy and this great venture of faith, which is not a venture after all, were never more nobly nor more simply expressed than in the quiet, but now, things being so, what do I wait for? My hope. In contrast to the false directions which other men takes, and to you I turn. The burden is still on the psalmist's shoulders. His sufferings, let us be clear, are not ended, though his trust has removed from them their poison. And so this renewed grasp of God leads us at once to prayer for deliverance from his transgressions, in which cry may be included both sin and chastisement. The fool is a name of a group and not an individual, and as always in Scripture denotes moral and religious obliquity, not intellectual feebleness. The expression is here substantially equivalent to the wicked we read of in verse 1, and a similar motive to that which there induced the psalmist to be silent is here urged as a plea with God for the sufferer's deliverance. Taunts launched at a good man's suffering will glance off him and appear to reach his God. Verse 9 pleads as a reason for God's deliverance the psalmist's silence under what he recognized as God's chastisement. The question arises whether this is the same silence as is referred to in verses 1 and 2, and many take that view. But that silence was broken by a rush of words from a hot heart, and if the account in the connection of the psalm given is correct, by a subsequent more placid meditation and prayer. And it would be irrelevant to repeat that here, especially as a plea with God. But there are two kinds of silence under his chastisement. One which may have for its motive regard to his honour, but is nonetheless tinged with rebellious thoughts and brings no good to the sufferer. And there is another which is silence of heart and will, not merely of lips, and soothes sorrow upon which the other only aggravated, and puts out the fire which the other fanned. Perfect submission to God's hand, discerned behind all visible causes, is the most blessed silence. To lie still, let him strike home and bless the rod, is best. And when that has been attained, the use of the chastisement is accomplished, and we may then venture to ask God to burn the rod. The desire to be freed from its blow is not inconsistent with such submission. This prayer does not break the silence, even though it may seem to do so, for this is the privilege of a heart that loves God. That they may breathe desires to him without holding them unsubmissive to his supreme will. The last part of today's psalm, verses 10 to 13, is rather longer than the others and falls naturally into two parts. The two pairs of verses are both petitions for the removal of sickness, be they either real or figurative. Their pleading persistence presents substantially the same prayer and supports it by the same considerations of man's transiency. The pattern then of perfect resignation is 3 times prayed, saying the same words, and his suffering followers may do the same, and yet neither sin by impatience nor weary their judge by their continual coming. The psalmist sees in his pain the stroke of God and pleads the effects already produced on him as a reason to stop. He is already wasted by the assault of God's hand. One more stroke and he feels that he must surely die. It is indeed bold for a sufferer to say to God, "Hold, enough." But all depends on the tone in which it is said. It may be presumptuous, or it may be the free speech of a child, not in the least refining the father's authority. The sufferer underrates his capacity of endurance and often thinks, "I can bear no more." But yet he has to bear it. And yet the psalmist's cry rests upon a deep truth, that God never means to completely crush, and therefore he goes on to a deeper insight into the meaning of that stroke. It is not the attack of an enemy, but the loving correction of a friend. If men regard sorrows and sickness as rebuke for iniquity, they would better understand why sinful life, being separated from God, is so fleeting. The characteristic ground of the Old Testament echoes here, according to which the reward for sin is death. The commonplace of man's frailty receives a still more tragic colouring when regarded thereby as a consequence of his sin. The psalmist has learnt in it his own suffering relationship, and because he sees it so clearly, he pleads that these may cease. He looks upon his own wasted form, and God's hand seems to him to have taken away all that made it desirable or fair, as a moth maybe would gnaw a garment. What a daring figure to compare the mightiest with the feeblest, the eternal with the very type of evanescence. And the final two verses reiterate the former with some difference of tone. There is the most beautiful climax of earnestness in the psalmist's appeal to God. His prayer swells up into tears which go straight to our great Father's hearts. Weeping eyes can never be turned to heaven in vain. The gates of mercy open wide and the hot drops touch upon them. But his fervour of desire is not this suppliant's chief argument with God. His meditation has won for him a deeper insight into that transiency which at first he had only laid like ice upon his heart to cool its fevered heat. Now he can see more clearly, by reason of his effort, to turn away his hope from the earth and fix it securely upon God. That his brief life has an aspect in which its brevity is not only calming, but exalting and exciting, and gives him a claim upon God, whose guest he is while he is here, and with whom he has the rights of a guest, whether his stay is longer or shorter. The land is mine, for you are strangers and sojourners with me, we read in Leviticus 25:23. That which was true in a special way of Israel's tenure of the soil is true for the individual and remains true for all time. All men are God's guests. If we betake ourselves behind the curtains of his tent, we have the right of shelter and sustenance. All the bitterness of the thought of the brevity of life is sucked out of it by such confidence. If a man dwells with God, his host will care for the needs and will not be indifferent to the tears of his guest. The long generations which have come and gone like shadows are not a melancholy procession out of nothing, through vanity, into nothing again. If they are conceived as such, in turn lodging for a little while in that same ancestral home which the present generation inhabits. It has seen many sons succeed their fathers as its tenants, but its stately strength does not grow old, and its gates are as open today as they have been for all generations past. The closing prayer in verse 13 has a certain strangeness to it. Look away from me is surely a strange prayer, and the effect of God's averting his face is no less peculiar. The psalmist thinks that it will be his regaining cheerfulness and brightness, for he uses a word which makes it to clear up or to brighten, as the sky becomes blue again after the storm. The light of God's face makes a man's face bright. They cried unto God, and they were lightened, not because he looked away from them, but because he had looked upon them. But the intended paradox gives the more emphatic expression to the thought that the psalmist's pains came from God's angry look, and it is that which he asks to be turned from him. That mere negative withdrawal would have no cheering power, and is not conceivable as unaccompanied by the turning of the suppliant of God's loving regard. The devout psalmist had no notion of a neutral God, nor could he ever be contented with the simple ending of the tokens of God's displeasure. The ever outflowing divine activity must reach every man. It may come in one or other of the two forms, favour or of displeasure. But come it will, and each man can determine that side of the pillar of fire or cloud is turned upon him. One is the red glare of anger, and on the other the white lustre of love. If the one is turned from, the other is turned to. Not less remarkable is the prospect of going away into non-being, which the last words of the psalm present as a piteous reason for a little gleam of brightness being vouchsafed in this span-long life. There is no vision here of a life beyond the grave, but although there is not, the singer throws himself into the arms of God. He does not seek to solve the problem of life by bringing the future to redress the balance of good and evil. To him, the one solution lies in sweet and present communion with a present loving God, in whose house he is a guest now, and whose face will make his life bright, however short it may be. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.